All right. Well, before I start, I'm going to also promote my own meeting, also related to foundation models in general. This one is called Neurocybernetics at Scale. This at scale can be interpreted in different ways, including scale of data, compute, timescales, and all of those. It's going to be in October. You can no longer submit abstracts, but you can register and come visit Lisbon. So with that, I'll get started. So, well, first, I would like to thank Mary and Cole for inviting me to this working group. Sounds like you guys are doing a lot of cool things. Uh, and yes, please interrupt me. I would love to get as much feedback and questions as possible as I'm presenting this today. All right. Well, this group probably doesn't need a lot of introduction to this, but I'll just say it anyways. So we've been promised that, now is the golden age of statistical neuroscience. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of high dimensional data from diverse recording situations. So can we have data-driven discovery of the organizing principles of the brain? Right. This is what was hoping for. But the reality is that a lot of the efforts that we have been working through and trying to model these things in a data-driven way are often fragmented. You're modeling just one condition or one kind of task from a few animals or so. And these are not really designed, that the current modeling efforts are not really designed to find coherent theories of how the brain works at some larger scale under diverse conditions. And this is somewhat disappointing. So the question is, how can we integrate large scales of data and all of these knowledge for data-driven discovery of organizing principles of neurodynamics underlying behavior? So hopefully this is consistent with the theme of your working group. And of course, the natural answer to this is the fashionable foundation model. Maybe foundation models are a good way to approach this. Again, you guys don't really need this definition, but foundation model is characterized by integrating a lot of data, typically pre-training a large model that can absorb all the spatial temporal statistics of the data, such that you can use it to do a lot of different kind of downstream tasks. The original definition is agnostic to architecture, but it turns out many of the successful foundation models in many areas turned out to be transformer styles. And the foundation model is to really have just one model that has many different usages. And I think when we're talking about these usages, these downstream tasks, what we really care about matters in terms of what kind of architecture or design principles we want to put in the foundation model itself. So I think I want to kind of divide foundation or foundation style models for neuroscience into two categories. These are not, the things in the boxes are not exclusive to each category. It's more like they're more specialized, perhaps. They're better suited for these downstream tasks. If your downstream task relies on extracting latent states, denoising your spike trains, getting some smoothed firing rates, or decoding in the context of brain-computer interface, or predicting brain activity from one area to another, or clinical medical application, we're trying to classify or diagnosis or prognosis of some disorders, then non-dynamical style models might suffice. On the other hand, and this dynamical style models may be better suited for if your task is to forecast neural activity, generate embodied behavior. If you need a model that if you put it in an environment, it has to behave, then a dynamical model might be better. If you want to infer the spatial temporal causal structures of the brain activities and computations, if you want mechanistic interpretation of the dynamical features, and if you want to reveal organizing principles of behavior, then dynamical models might be better suited for this. Does this make sense? Okay. I put some existing models. I know there are gazillion foundation models these days, but these are the ones that I've seen recently and over the years. Again, for this audience, I don't really have to go through each of these, and since many of you are actually the ones who worked on these. But as you can see, many of them are transformer-based and not inherently dynamical in a sense. Of course, it could be used as an inference tool that can capture the spatial temporal structures. So it's not like there's no dynamics in it, but the structure of the model does not contain dynamics, and it's not trying to separate out the dynamics from the rest of the statistical structures. And in the dynamical model side, I didn't know how many to put in here, but so I'm putting some of these as these gray colors because they are not fully foundation style models sometimes, but they have some of the interesting features in here. Of course, LFADs, which I'll get back to in a few slides. And more recently, I guess you guys had one of those meetings about Possum, which I'm very excited about, and POCO. I don't know if POCO is on your radar. It's also an interesting model. And today I want to tell you about our own in this category, the meta-dynamical state space model. Yeah, I think some of these categorizations might be debatable, so give me feedback if you have any. Okay, so why dynamical? I mean, there are many reasons to look into dynamics, including these downstream tasks. But another reason is that this dynamical description of computation is a good language on its own. It's good for representing cognitive computation. This point was made by Van Gelder a few decades ago. For embodied behavior, for general neural information processing, dynamical system language, both theoretically and practically, are very useful. They are interpretable. I'm putting quotes here because this is a dangerous language. We have made some interesting progress in interpreting dynamical systems using these archetypes of dynamics. I will not get into too much detail here. I'll just point at our recent archive paper. And these dynamics on low-dimensional manifolds, so-called manifold hypothesis, seems to be holding pretty strongly, including the recent paper by Matt Parrish. And so the hypothesis here for me is that maybe the dynamical systems level of this description, this abstract description, maybe capturing what's common across similar behavior. It's not the gene expression, it's not the neurons that map from one organism to another or one animal to a subject to another. Maybe not even neural data or neural state trajectories or manifolds, but really the dynamical system itself is what has to be similar. The underlying implementation could be different, right? We might need some different kinds of alignments and implementation underlying each of these dynamics. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, so over the years, there have been many methods that are data-driven to extract dynamical systems from data. So if you have neurons over time, let's say population recordings across a lot of time or many trials, you can do some machine learning inference to get a dynamic system view. Many of these methods are written in a state space model format, which has two sub-models, basically two equations that describe the generating process for this data. You have the dynamics model that captures the temporal aspect of this, where your latent state ZT is evolving over time according to a particular law of dynamics, F. So if you can learn F, given your observations, we can then do a lot of things with this F. And then given the latent state Z, then the latent states are related to the observations through some probabilistic noise model. It could be a Poisson spike generation process. It could be a Gaussian noise generation process, depending on your observations. So this, you can crank the machine learning tools to estimate all of these things, given only the observations, just the spike trains and maybe the spike trains and some behavior and stimulus. And once you get this F, then we can now go to the interpretation mode, perhaps. Of course, the big problem here is how do you parameterize this F, right? So practically speaking, most of engineering and machine learning really likes to use a dynamical model F that's linear, because then all your computation is very fast. It does pretty well in explaining your data, and so on. But since we care about non-linear dynamical systems, perhaps we need to think about what kind of parameterization we need. There are many different kinds of parameterization we could consider. I'm just trying to categorize roughly what kinds of parameterization that are popular. Again, linear dynamics is very popular. If you think of physics, physics typically has very nice, concise forms like Newtonian dynamics. It has multiplications and special functions that serve as a basis to explain the dynamics. So methods like SINDI or some polynomial basis symbolic regression problems are popular if your systems are physical systems. But of course, that's not necessarily the case in the brain, because the neural dynamics underlying certain computations can be very flexibly expressed, and they could learn many different kinds of functions. So it's unreasonable to assume polynomials or trigonometric functions would be a good basis for expressing the dynamics. So you could go for a non-parametric form where you have Gaussian processes, kernel methods, multi-layer perceptrons, get as flexible as possible, then you'll need a lot of parameters, right? So the other extreme is with this lot of parameters problems. And there are some other specialized methods to do this. I won't go to too much detail, but just that there are many different choices. And so one of the problems that I want to address today is, can we find the parameterization that we want that's useful for expressing neural dynamics in general? Because what we've been doing so far in our previous approaches, we were using very flexible non-parametric methods for expressing these F. So our number of parameters typically are in the thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, just to express the flexibly express this F in some low dimensional space, perhaps 10-dimensional or 20-dimensional space. But that's definitely not ideal. Okay, so what we've been doing, again, is given one data set, we would fit one dynamical system with one certain parameterization of that particular dynamics. So if my data set is small, then I will not have enough statistical power to fit a good model that has a lot of parameters. So I have to make my model very simple. So these are very data hungry kind of methods if you choose a very flexible parameterization for dynamics. And if you fit individual data sets like this, then each of these data sets has to be large and have good signal to noise ratio to be able to find a good function. So the other approach is to say, oh no, look, I have 3 animals and 10 sessions of recordings from these animals doing the same task. Maybe they're all doing some working memory tasks. They're highly trained. Their behavior is almost the same. I'm going to assume there's a common dynamical system that everybody's using the same thing or approximate to the same thing. I'm just going to average them and smooth them together to build one common brain model, right? But the issue here is, well, there are multiple issues. The first issue, of course, is that if there are individual variations, maybe one animal was trained in a slightly different way. They didn't quite achieve the same performance. Maybe another animal has a longer reaction time or using a different strategy. All of these variations that are interesting and sometimes is the goal of analysis will not be able to be captured in this approach. The other problem of having these data sets trying to match to one central model is that you're sampling from different sets of neurons. Sometimes you see completely disjoint neurons because you have completely different arrays in different cortical areas of monkeys, for example. Of course, if you're in worms or insects, the situation might be different, but in general, in primates, this is typically the case. And one of the solutions, there are a couple of strategies. One of the solutions, early solution, was given by Elfad's paper in 2018, where they had per session separate read-in matrix that would transform different number of neurons, try to map them into a common latent space before processing. And so if you have multiple sessions, you have per session individual matrices that map this to this common latent factor. And there's one common machinery that assumes the dynamics, the temporal structure of the system to be common and fit it this way. And the other approach is the Poyo style approach, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. So I will skip that. Okay, so going back to the challenges, so there are these variations across animals could happen because of many reasons, but one interesting thing that could happen is learning. While the animal is learning, the system is changing, right? You're changing the weights, maybe you're growing new connections. So if you think about the space of the weights, which represents each point in the space of weights really represent a particular dynamical system, it might be changing constantly, and it might be changing drastically in terms of if there's a bifurcation point where you target dynamical system requires changing the face portrait in a qualitative way. And oftentimes when I give a talk about or present one of my papers about estimating dynamical systems from data, they will often ask me, can I apply this to my learning problem? My animal is learning over time. I'm really interested in how they learn. Can I track their learning? And oftentimes I have to say no, because you will never have enough data to capture the 100,000 parameters that I need in my model if the animal's system is changing in 100,000 dimensional space. I can't track it, just don't have enough statistical power to do so. So that's one problem that we would like to address. And as I briefly mentioned, there are variations of dynamics given different conditions. In this case, different task conditions could generate very different dynamical systems. So if you want to capture all of this together, a single model common to all tasks and conditions might not be appropriate. And just to labor these individual differences a little bit more, there are many cases where individuals would do the task in a different way, including how they run around, how they navigate a one-dimensional array, and how they react to different conditions of the task. The individuality is interesting, and what we want to capture this particular individualities and really find if there's a principle, organizing principle across these variations. Hopefully these are low dimensional variations such that we can extract it from across data sets. And finally, I will give you one more reason that we need such a model, which is this real-time state space modeling challenge. So in my lab, we focus a lot in trying to process data, incoming data, neural recordings in real time to estimate the internal state, the state in the state space every time point, and then also estimate the underlying dynamical system, the F that I talked about earlier, in real time. So within the recording when you start the recording, start the experiment, we want to quickly capture the dynamics such that we can use this dynamics to all sorts of interesting things, including control and exploration, right? Trying to inject different stimulation or perturbation to the system to verify our hypothesis about the system, what the computation is, and also explore, is this really an attractor? You know, is this really a one-dimensional limit cycle, for example? So to do all of these things, we really need to quickly learn from little data. So this sample efficient estimation is a very important ingredient in doing a closed loop experiment when we want to use very flexible dynamic system models. Yeah, so we have a short perspective piece at UCIPCO last year. If you're interested, you can look at this for the details of the real-time neuroscience part. Okay, so the solution to this was emerging in 2023. This was, we were heavily inspired by this work, Dynamo, and this was an approach to learn the solution space of dynamics. So if you have, this was not about neural data analysis too much, it was about really recurrent neural networks. So if you have a bunch of recurrent neural networks that solve some task, you can have many different recurrent neural networks that might solve the task in slightly different ways. And the question is, can we combine all of these recurrent neural network solutions for each model learning one kind of, have one kind of weight matrix, have one kind of behavior, but solves the task in a way? Can we parameterize all of these families of RNNs that seem to solve the task very well and generate a one mega model, like a meta model, where you can parameterize that meta model to say, now you behave like, model one, now you behave like model two. Can we find that compression of these models in a way? So we wanted to do something like this, but on neural data, because the way that they did it at this time at the Dynamo, they were doing on models, right? You already have to have models per task or conditions, then you can combine all of them together. But in our case, some data sets might be small, we might not be able to capture a good model. So why not do it all jointly across all data sets and utilize the joint statistical power of all data sets that are related to the particular case. So that's when we got to work on this meta-dynamical state space model. It's a hierarchical foundation model, and I should have put it in quotes. It's not really a foundational model yet because we have not absorbed enormous amounts of data, nor we have demonstrated its applicability to many different downstream tasks. But I think it has a strong potential. This work was spearheaded by Aisha Vermani, my PhD student. She's graduating this year, and she's on the job market. So if you're looking for a postdoc, she's awesome. And also Jose Nassar, Matt Dowling, and Hyungju Chun in my lab. So the idea is pretty simple. So if you have recordings, let's say you have recording A, neurons by time, by trials, we want to fit one dynamic system model. Let's say parameterized by theta here. So Z is my latent state over time. Y is my data coming from recording A, I'm labeling as small a. So this particular recording will have its own observation model. So CA is a matrix that's going to be attached to this recording A that maps the latent state Z, hopefully low dimensional, to the recordings. And if you have recording B, so the trick here is now I want this system, I want to use the system again for recording B. So I'm going to add a embedding vector, EA. I'm going to this dynamical embedding vector, EA, so that if you condition on EA, I want this f of theta to transform into explaining data set A. So it's going to be a point in the embedding space. And if I change this embedding, keep f theta the same, theta is just constant fixed, but if I choose a different embedding, it can now explain the recording B. Given that if I refit this observation model CB, right? So for each data set, I'm going to have its own observation model, and I'm going to have different embedding vector. So this dynamical embedding space does not change over time, but it changes over data sets or different conditions, right?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So if what's the assumption when f theta is fixed? Is that just saying like why, is there a world where you have this embedding space modulate theta? Or because like I would imagine then you're assuming that the dynamics are really like shared in some sense because the f function is the same. It's just now you're conditioning these dynamics differently, but you expect the dynamics to still be like the same across each of these recordings, or am I misunderstanding?
Right. The dynamics is parameterized by theta and also EA in a sense, right? So I will show you the exact architecture of this F that we use, and it's going to make more sense then. But basically, it has two parameters. One is theta that's common to all, and the other one is related to EA, E's, that's going to change from session to session, or if it's a learning paradigm, one state of learned dynamics to another state. Right.
So if you
So
were,
what?
sorry, so if you were like, would this make sense in the context of like animals doing two different tasks, and like you could embed this into the same framework, or would f theta like f theta being fixed is flexible enough? Maybe I should wait for you to actually explain it, but
Yeah. I mean, if you
what's
wait just a
the
little bit, that parameterization should make sense. But yes, if you have different conditions where you expect the dynamics to be different, hopefully you'll have that difference will be explained by having different E. Yeah. And this space, this dynamical embedding space, is really just capturing the family of dynamical systems, right? Each point here is a dynamical system, and each dynamical system explains some data. Yeah. So it could be monkey A, monkey B in a rough sense, but it could be even within the monkey A, day one and day two, or within even day one and day two, it could be session one and session two, maybe condition B and condition C, if if that's what you want, right? So let me get into slightly more detail here. So let's say we have I denoting the session. We want to have for each session an embedding EI, and we want this embedding EI to spit out a low rank matrix components that will add to theta. So that's the effective theta of this network will have some low rank component added to it. In fact, it's an MLP. So the architecture is from ZT to ZT plus one. There's a multi-layer perceptron in it. And in the multi-layer perceptron, the two hidden layers, in the intermediate two hidden layers, we have a injection of this low rank matrix that we're adding to the common matrix W on the dynamics. And this low rank matrix we're adding is an output of a hypernetwork that's a function of the embedding. So the embedding is typically in our experiments 1, 2, or 3 dimensions. And this W here is like 100 by 100. Yeah. So this is a big matrix, and this is like a rank 2 or to 5 update of that big matrix that we're controlling. So that's the basic architecture of how we're parameterizing theta and how we're adding this thing. What is common across all data sets are all the gray ones. So the MLP on the theta part and hypernetwork will be fixed. Once you pre-train the whole thing, these are all fixed. For any new data set, you only have to provide this new embedding, basically, if you want to do like a zero-shot learning. And this architecture we took it because hypernetworks are cool, and also it just works, it turns out. I will show you the example of when this embedding is not going through the hypernetwork, but added as an shared input, so as an input, because multi-layer perceptron is a universal functional approximator. That should also work. You can do it as an input or as a hypernetwork. Performance is slightly different. Okay. Yeah, so that I already said. So that's the generative model. If the generative model makes sense, what I'm going to show you is how to do the inference in time, at the inference time.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So does the theta here only contain the W, like the recurrent weight?
Yes, the theta will contain multiple W's here with the gray part of the task, and also this really the hypernetwork is part of it, but yeah.
Okay. And the nonlinearity in this state space model is fixed.
The nonlinearity is fixed. We use, I believe this was CLU, but it doesn't matter too much.
Okay.
It's, the exact parameters that we use is in the paper, so you can look at it.
Okay.
So this is the generative model. So to learn a good generative model, we are using amortized inference, variational amortized inference, and we are using two things to try to solve that problem of having different neurons for each data set. So if you have data sets 1, 2, and 3, we will have a read-in network. So this is different from C. This is a network that's a part of the recognition network or the inference network that will generate the posterior over the latent states, and also the embedding. So the embedding is actually not inferred or given by the user. It is inferred from data itself. So given any new data set, or even one of these data sets, we will learn per session read-in network. This is a multi-layer perceptron again, that maps your data into some common recording space. This is a, you can think of it mostly as a dimensionality reduction. So we're going to put this all in a common space where the dimensionality is equal. And given this, now that every data set is the same dimensionality, we feed it through a recurrent neural network to spit out the embedding vector. So the embedding vector is a function of my data. And also, if I also have this bidirectional recurrent neural network that takes in as input these transformed data and the embedding vector and spits out a posterior over the Z's. This is basically a sequential variational autoencoder, if you know this literature. So we have 3 more neural networks that spit out these components, but as all you need after training, you only need to retrain these read-in networks per data set, and everything else is the same. So learning of this read-in network, we'll call it aligning, and also the emission, the CIs corresponding to each session. So these 2 things we need to train per data set. Training is just the regular variational inference using evidence lower bound, where we have reconstruction error, we have the dynamics, Kullback library divergence on the dynamics, and then we have the encoder for the dynamical embedding E itself. Our prior for the embedding is just zero mean Gaussian that makes sure that our embeddings are near 0 and they're not scattered too much. And once we learn this encoder, Q alpha, it spits out an E. Given this E, the second encoder, Q beta, spits out a posterior over Z's. Right? And these Z's need to be obeying that transitions in the generative model. So we maximize all the elbow for all parameters end to end. So it will learn all the networks jointly. And once we pre-train this on data, the question is, is it useful? Does it provide enough useful inductive bias for doing this? So just to reiterate what exactly happens, is that for each data set, that's in the test set, we'll learn this omega n, which is the read-in network that transforms the neural signals to this common dimensions, and also Cn, which is the emission from the this Cn that projects from the latent states to the observations. So you learn all of this, and the network just spits out a bunch of ENs given each data set. In practice, we do this in a mini batch. For those of you who are interested in the details, we'll give a bunch of trials, put it in a mini batch, aggregate. This Q alpha network will spit out this embedding for each of these trials. We'll aggregate across an average to produce one embedding. For the alignment, if you're interested, we also have a separate paper for this.
Sorry,
The data set I will show you is also widely used. This is the motor cortex reaching data sets. There were 40 center outreach data sets and 4 maze condition reach data sets together. So we're training on 44 sessions with these recordings, and there are 4 monkeys basically. As you know, these reaches are very stereotypical, and the question is, can we forecast the future? These are latent states over time. At the time of movement onset, can you forecast the future neural activity or the latent states over time? Can you decode the behavior over time? And so on. So we're going to evaluate these 2 things. We're going to generate signals of after the movement onset. So this model is time locked onto the movement onset for this result that I'm going to show you. After the joint training, we have used a 2-dimensional embedding. Yeah, you have a question?
Yes, so I did have a question about the architecture. So the embedding encoder, if you don't mind. So I think my understanding was that embedding would be a static vector that is like specified for each session. But it seems here like, do you need to like look at the entire recording to infer what the E is? Is that the case, or is it like dynamic change over time?
So we can do this per trial. I mean, the encoder itself will spit out an embedding given any amount of data. But in practice, what we're doing is we're taking a mini batch, I think, of 5 trials, and it'll spit out, 5 embedding vectors, and we'll just average them and use that as embedding vector for those 5 trials. So in practice, we have a distribution of embedding vectors they were sampling, but they're very tightly connected to each other. We don't see like a mini batch that gives you completely different embedding vectors. They're very tightly connected. So we're not worried about that aspect. But yes, you're right that this is data dependent, and we are not putting all the data together to get a batch embedding vector. We're doing mini batch.
I see. And did you find that there's a minimal number of trials that you would use to observe in order to get a good estimate of the embedding?
Actually, 1 trial was sufficient. So early on, what we did was per trial, we would plot these embedding vectors, and it would actually show interesting trial variation structure in the embedding space as well. But that was too complicated to present, so I'm not going to show it to you. But we did see that some trials, there are some trial information, different reach directions. There was also variations for trials, were all captured in variations in the embedding vector. But it's very hard to interpret that as differences in the dynamical system. We didn't want to do that. So we're presenting this as an aggregate version of it, but it is very possible to do this per trial. Yeah.
I see. So like what you find is that there's still, even though the assumption is that the embedding would be like, I guess, stable over entire recording if it's the same task and same conditions, you find that if you treat each trial separately, that the embedding moves around a lot, like there's a lot of variation. Okay.
Not a lot. It's still very tight, but it shows interesting additional structures that, I mean, we could get into this, but I'm not going to show it to you today. Also, it destroys my story.
No worries. Okay, good. No, thank you for clarifying it makes sense, at least the part of like taking the mini batch like trials and using that for estimating the embedding. Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, just maybe it's related to the previous question, but maybe you already answered it. But did you try like with session embeddings, you take like a one-hot embedding, like a one-hot vector for every session, and you could map that one-hot vector to, through your embedding encoder as well, and get the U and V, right? So it could learn, instead of averaging, like using the data, you could just learn with the session ID, right? Have you tried that, or am I misunderstanding something?
This is a different approach. So the session ID approach is to freeze a network and do gradient descent on session ID, right? Basically, if you encounter a new data set, you need to infer that session ID vector. In this way, we are amortizing that as well. So there's a data-dependent encoder that just spits it out. We don't have to do the gradient descent. So that, I think, effectively, they might be equivalent. We didn't test it. We didn't test if we do gradient descent, we'll get the same result. But I think it's complementary approach. We should try. Or you guys should try this way.
Actually, that makes me think like potentially the omega networks contain, like the bias of the omega network could be the session embedding itself, like the learnable equivalent of the session embeddings that are used in other networks like Poyo. Like basically, if the bias is a session embedding, it's still a learnable session specific kind of like vector that is learned during training, and that could be added indirectly towards like the E embedding at the end, right? Could that be?
Yeah. But again, I guess we can't, if it's really out of distribution, our network probably can't give you the right session embedding. But if you're doing gradient descent, maybe it can do some out of distribution better than this method. Yeah. There will be pros and cons. This will be fast. I guess session embedding also is not too slow.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Great questions. Okay, so results. So again, for these 44 monkeys, not monkeys, 4 monkeys, 44 sessions, we used a two-dimensional dynamic embedding space. So the E1, E2 are the embedding space. Each dot here corresponds to one session of data. This is, again, I'm not showing you all the E's for each mini batch. I'm just showing you average of it. And color is different monkey. Okay, so what you see is it's around 0 because it's supposed to be around 0. And then the clustering of subject C, there was most amount of data from this subject C. There was center out task, and there's some structure in here. The yellow ones are somewhat spread out in a different way, and the maze conditions are in this rim here. And if you look at each of these embedding and look at what the corresponding dynamics is, you can initialize the system with certain initialization that you've seen before, plug in these values, simulate from the system. These are just the PCAs of the latent state trajectory that would generate. This is a dynamic system, so it can generate any amount of data for different conditions, which are initial conditions for this case. And you can also decode from this, and you'll generate predicted decoding results. Each of these colored lines are different monkey reaches for the test set. You can see that they are generating something, and the center out conditions and the maze conditions are qualitatively quite different. And if you look at how this performs in generalization, we want to see for a held out session for the same monkey, how well it does in predicting behavior. This is with 8 trials. These are random 8 trials for this data set. This is a center out task. Purple is our method. Shared dynamics is having one model that jointly fits all data without session embedding. Single session is one model per session. So this, in this case, this held out session just has a new model on its own. Embedding input is, instead of using a hypernetwork, taking the embedding input as input to the multi-layer perceptron. And as you increase the number of trials that the model sees, all you're doing here, when you're increasing this, what you're doing is we're not training anything else but the alignment. So we have this read-in network that learns the omega I. That what we're training is that guy and the C for this particular session. Those are the only things that are trained. Everything else in this case are zero shot in that sense. So only aligning, no fine tuning in this result. And you can see, I mean, it gets better. And here we're seeing new subject. So, the bottom was new subject. Here you're seeing scaling in terms of just connecting these dots. You can see for new subject versus held out session, the generalization performance is going up dramatically better. Yes, question.
Sorry, what's embedding input and why is it better than our method? What exactly is it? I'm just curious.
It is not necessarily always better.
Sorry, I just mean in that one case.
Yes. It is sometimes better. I mean, but it makes sense. So I'll try to draw. So we had ZT, and then we had an MLP with some intermediate layer and ZT plus 1. We had our method was having the embedding vector come in here to add this low rank component. This embedding input version is to have EI come in here and don't have this. It's still perfectly fine. I mean, I'm just parameterizing this, right? In two different ways. Because MLP is a universal functional approximator, it should be able to do this as well. So the question is the hypernetwork giving us a good inductive bias in a sense? And it does. I mean, this one example here, somehow it does well in 64, but that's an exception. In general, this hypernetwork works better. Then you can, yes, question.
I have a follow-up question. So if you keep increasing the number of training samples, will you see that the embedding input one keeps outperforming your method?
In this particular held out subject, I don't know. I mean, we should really do a larger scale experiment, right? Because we only have 4 monkeys. So it's hard to say.
I see. So is the number of samples means the number of trials?
Yes. So typically these sessions have 1,000, more than 1,000 trials. But we're using very small data. This is an impressive R-square for using only 64 trials to predict for the subject.
I see.
Yeah, I don't know what the Poyo plus numbers are, but we thought this was very impressive. Yes, Cole.
Sorry, just one more question about so for your method versus the single session, what does the pre-training look like? Like how much data, maybe you already said this, but I missed it, but like are you pre-training on thousands of trials or are you pre-training on a couple monkeys? Like what's the difference between the single session and the method?
Single session is just one session, 1,000 trials or so. Our method was pre-trained on 3 monkeys, like 30 sessions. Yeah, so that we don't have that scaling plot because we didn't do that experiment. We should do that when we have more, when we include more data. So that's in our to-do. Yeah. Okay, so just to zoom in a little bit on the space, this embedding space, is there a meaning? I mean, the frequently asked question is, does E1 mean anything? E2 mean anything? Is this really a continuous space of dynamical systems as we want it? And so this is a small part of it. And if you go around the space and try to predict what behavior it will generate, if I had a virtual monkey at that location, you'd see smooth variations of this. So it's not learning like discrete strategy and putting just in a continuous space and using it. It's really a smooth space where we can interpolate if you really wanted to interpolate or go around and see what the structure is. And so this means we're really learning a manifold of dynamical systems, and hopefully this will generalize when we get more data into the system. Okay, so that was the motor cortex. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. I guess we're running out of time. I'm going to show you a couple of examples where we tried this in other scenarios. This is a super simple delayed comparison task where we have learned one RNN was trained on this, and we were looking at, can we track the RNN's dynamic system as it's learning? So this epoch here is this one RNN being trained on this task. That task is not super important. This is an easy task. So as you're doing gradient descent, you're going through these epochs and you get different dynamic system that the RNN is using to try to solve the problem, right? It needs to learn a continuous attractor in this example. And this embedding here is applying the meta-dynamical state space model on the RNN's observed RNN trajectories. It does not know anything else. It just knows, oh, this set of trials are from this RNN, this learning epoch. And it tracks the embedding vector is tracking a one-dimensional progression of learning, right? So the hope is that if we have multiple animals learning some task, we can generate a similar embedding structure and see, oh, these animals are learning and this strategy, maybe they all converge in a similar way, maybe are not converging the same way, and it's even more interesting. Haven't done it yet, but we have tested it to see if it's possible. This is an example of, again, you guys probably all know this data set very well. This is Laura Driscoll's compositional task structure RNN that's trained. So we took the RNN, it was pre-trained RNN, set these compositional tasks. We have memory anti, memory delay anti, memory pro, and delay pro. So for these conditions, with task condition given to this RNN, we looked at the activation over time, fed it to this meta-dynamical state space model, trained on all of them together, and looked at the embedding itself. And the embedding shows a two-dimensional separation of these compositionality. The compositionality is very discrete in this case, because anti versus pro, you have to flip the readout. The delay versus memory, you have a different temporal structure and what you have to do. And with the embedding vectors, in this case, we're plotting samples from the posterior on the embedding vector. So you have multiple points here, but it's really, you can see it's very tight. Delay versus memory is in one axis, and anti versus pro is in the other axis, anti versus pro. This is the anti versus pro axis. This is the delay versus memory axis. So it's using the continuous space to represent different composition structure as factorizing in different axes. So again, this is interesting. I mean, we did not expect to see this. I was hoping for something like this, but we actually saw this. And the question is, for non-temporally compositional tasks where your conditions are like, oh, grab a slippery mug versus a textured paper cup, and the execution is simultaneous in time, can we still get this kind of compositionality in the embedding? Would be an interesting application of this. Since we are running out of time, I'll just briefly mention that we think this is a good inductive bias, and this is only the beginning of really getting to a foundation model, because this was a very small set of experiments we did where the behaviors were quite similar. And in general, we want to build a bigger hierarchy where different conditions, different brain areas perhaps, and different tasks and behaviors are hierarchically represented. So conditioned on many of these metadata, or maybe even hidden conditions, we can build a low dimensional embedding that's hierarchically represented. So maybe some of the variables are externally controlled, some of the variables are inferred, but with a concise description of what the dynamic system is doing at that time for some short period of, in some relevant time scale, let's say tens of seconds, right? So that's our eventual goal in trying to build this foundation model, dynamical style foundation model for neuroscience. I'll thank everybody who did the work. Matt Dowling, Aisha Vermani, who did most of the work. Hyungju Jun helped a lot. Jose also spiritually helped a lot. And most of this work was funded by NIH R1 and other funding sources. Thank you all for listening. Happy to take more questions.
Thank you. Any questions for people on Zoom? Let's make sure there's someone maybe on Zoom before you call. If you think I'll call, but
I think Alex has a question.
oh,
Oh,
Alex, yeah, please.
No, sorry. I was just like applauding you. Thanks for the presentation. It was great, but it was I mean, I have some spot that I don't understand, but more because of my background and non-clarity of the presentation, I think.
sorry,
Thanks.
I was assuming a lot of knowledge because of the experts in the audience and the workshop, the working group itself. But yeah, thanks.
Yes, call, please.
Yeah, that was amazing. Yeah, really, really cool talk. Have you thought about you know, analyzing? So a couple questions. Like you chose a very specific structure for U and V being low rank. If you can give some insight into like why you did that and like what that means, that'd be great. And then also building on that, have you looked at like shared dynamics versus non-shared dynamics, like actually analyzing those things? And have you thought about like disentanglement? Because like by I think by design at the moment, they're going to share information between the shared and non-shared. But if you thought about like disentanglement penalties or trying to make sure these encode different things so you can look, because like everyone asks with these like these foundation models, well, what's shared and what's unique with each animal? And it seems like your approach is a really cool way to get at that. I'm curious if you've done that and some of your choices there and yeah, disentanglement and lots of stuff, but I'll let you answer.
Yeah, great question. I mean, we are very interested in the interpretation of the embedding vectors, which will require putting more disentanglement priors into it. We have not done it yet, but at the same time, it might not be super easy to do this unsupervised way. So, but there are machine learning techniques that can make it more interpretable and more disentangled. So we will try some of these. About the structure, the architecture of low rank update, I mean, we were inspired, of course, by the LoRa. In large language models, they do fine tuning by low rank update on the weights. It seems to be very effective in fine tuning. So that's part of it. And also other hypernetworks people use are of low rank update structure. It's not a principled answer, I know, but more a practical one. You could interpret this as like a thalamic input. So if you think of these multi-layer MLP between T and T+1 as going to another brain area and then coming back, and then updating that other brain area with some low dimensional gain, you could try to interpret that as a thalamic bridge, thalamocortical bridge, but that's probably way over interpreting what our architecture is. So I will actually take that back.
Yeah. Just do you think part of the like you have this low rank structure? Do you think that's part of why the embedding input starts to do better than the hypernetwork with lots of samples? Because like you've constrained the hypernetwork to be low rank output. Whereas if you just put the E in, or you put the embedding in, it can just learn whatever it wants in any form, right? Do you think there's a difference in expressivity, which is causing, like when you started seeing lots of samples, it could learn some sort of arbitrarily complex mapping that is more expressive than a low rank like hyper network thing?
I don't think so. They are both universal functional approximators. They probably have different inductive biases on the dynamics. And that one point there that the embedding input version did better is an exception. In general, the hypernetwork does better. Yeah.
So
But that architecture, we're not tied to that architecture. What is more important is a conceptual framework. I mean, we might find a different parameterization that's even better than this. Yeah.
Yeah, so I do have a maybe a broader question that I like to ask, and I think it could help to discuss this within this working group, which is kind of the question of scaling. What is next? Kind of what are the main barriers to scaling the method that you presented? Like, for example, I can think of you were mentioning a lot of like talking about data and adding diversity in terms of subjects and potentially tasks. And I guess I would add also the question of how could you imagine kind of scaling this method for naturalistic behavior or like brain activity where you don't actually have this like trial structured repeated kind of task. Do you think that this method could scale to those types of approaches? And what do you think are the main challenges for you and for us as a community for kind of like getting to the scale of like these large foundation models trained on multiple data sets?
Yeah, the community has a challenge. We are suffering from the same challenge. Yeah, let's see. So easy question first. The trial structure, we don't need this trial structure at all, and we don't need this sequential VAE. We have a much better way of handling this. It's just not integrated into this framework yet. So those are not the problem. The problem is probably how do we scale it up such that as we get more and more data and more conditions, we need to increase the dimensionality of the embedding, increase also the dimensionality of the latent space. And if you don't constrain these enough with, as autoencoders do, they will just memorize and overfit, right? So finding that balance in a complicated hierarchical network where most of the inference is not in the generative model, but in the training of the inference network, which is super powerful because it has like 4 neural networks in it, that is going to be a challenge, engineering challenge and practical challenge. So that means we might need a lot of students and compute in practice. I mean, you know the problems.
Yeah.
I don't know have a solution to this, but thankfully the machine learning literature is moving fast, and with the vibe coding and the agentic programming, perhaps I don't need 100 grad students. Maybe 5 grad students will do it. I don't know.
That's fair. Do you think like how about data? Do you think there's enough data to be able to train these models? I guess there's a wide types of experiments in neuroscience where data is collected for, motor areas mostly and like, depending on the animal and such. But do you think there's limitations in the data, or is that something that we'll have to deal with in the future?
I guess there are two different things. So there are easier problems, statistically speaking, where the latent dimension is low and the flexibility across task and individuals low. Perhaps motor and high-level cognitive tasks belong here. And so those would be the ones that we will go for first. But of course, in the eventual goal of doing diverse things, naturalistic, high-dimensional brain areas, we might need to be more innovative. This is just one idea. I think we need many ideas to be able to do this, and perhaps a lot of people in the community together solving this problem. The other problem, of course, is sampling. This model can only generalize mostly around where the data lives, and we are sampling in the task space, condition space, and also neuron space, brain areas. We typically don't get like brainstem or proprioception data from these large scale recordings. So we only see the shadows of this, which may be sufficient at the abstract dynamical system level, but it would always be better to have more sampling of these brain areas. So one thing we are considering, and I think the field should consider seriously, is the model guided data collection. The model will say, I have no idea about these kind of things. I'm very uncertain about what to do in these situations. Please give me more data in this areas, right? So if we can build that in, that in the loop of doing science as a community, which will require hundreds of people, at least hundreds of people, to collect valuable data that's valuable to the model and valuable to integrated theory, that would be awesome. And that is only a vision that I could share. I can't implement this on my own.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, that's why this working group, one of the goals to like see what are the common kind of challenges that we're all facing when building these models and how we could, you know, find common solutions. I agree with what you said also, like regarding like the solution. I think it's going to be multiple components from different types of approaches that we could use to kind of help deal with the lack of data scale and potentially compute scale as well. But yeah, the final question that I had, which is also something I always want to bring up, is like benchmarking and evaluation of these models. I think you had a nice slide kind of giving a nice kind of inventory of multiple models and different approaches with different goals. I guess the different goals for like building these foundation models. But I guess like I think there's an emphasis on one of the main metrics being, you know, decoding behavior. But do you think there are other ways we could evaluate the models to better understand how far we're going, or like how far we are from our goal of like, for example, doing better interpretability or forecasting of neural activity, or like how are you able to measure these different things when we're working on so many different data sets?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, the benchmarking and evaluation depends on what you care about. Interpretability is a very tricky one because there's almost no easy way of quantifying interpretability. What are you going to do? You're going to have a room full of smart people, give them some interpretation and score them? It's going to be very difficult. So I would say that's very difficult to quantify. What is easier to quantify, perhaps, is behavior, because in our case, we're interested in understanding behavior. So one of the criteria is the model has to be able to behave. So if you put like a virtual animal in a like reinforcement learning kind of arena, couple it with the model learned instantiated dynamics, that if the animal generates meaningful behaviors, naturalistic behaviors, and maximizing some normative functions in our eyes, that would be a good model, right? So those could be quantified better, and that's a perhaps difficult challenge to make a model that can behave like multiple animals depending on your conditioning. But in a shorter scale, in an easier scale, it would be mostly for us, it would be forecasting. Given these conditions and this input, will the model behave in some hundreds of milliseconds? Maybe not in full closed loop, generate behavior in closed loop for tens of seconds, but maybe few hundred milliseconds, can it behave like a real system? Then I would say that's a good proxy before we go into this bigger evaluation.
I see. No, that's helpful. Thank you so much. We'll take any other questions that people might have, and otherwise, I don't know if there are any other questions. Great. Well, thank you so much, Mehmet. It was a really great talk, learning about all the, like, I guess I've been reading some of your papers on like dynamical systems for like the kind of the intersection of foundation models and dynamical systems, and it's really interesting. And it has like a lot of different advantages over kind of like the more simple brain decoding approaches. So there's a lot to learn there. So thank you so much for your talk. It was really insightful. And
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Cole.
Yeah.
It was my pleasure to talk.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending. We'll see you next month. Bye, everyone.